Today, Chuck and Brock talk about mental representation, Chapter 25, by Professor Panaccio, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
We are talking again, and Chuck, I feel like I owe the people listening to us an apology because I love to say this chapter is the most important chapter in the book. But if you say that for every single chapter, at some point you're going to lose some effect taking liberties there. But at the same point in time, this chapter on mental representations could be the most important chapter in this book. Chuck, let me quick throw it over to you and just get your quick read on where we are now, given what we've talked about last week and then the week before, getting into the mental representations, the species format, those kinds of things.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about a little bit since the last time we talked and haven't had a lot of time to dig into, but at least thought about and we'll probably do a little bit more digging in. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts as well. But we spent the last couple of weeks talking a little bit about how we have this sense that the medievals ought to be given more credit than they often are, that they understood a lot of things, and perhaps because they had only certain background knowledge to rely on, some of their ideas today don't seem particularly well thought out, or we find some problems with. And yet, so much of what they discussed is really relevant today. And even though we may not come to all of the same conclusions as they did today, that they did in the medieval, we've been rather impressed with the breadth and depth of their philosophizing. And especially as we got towards the last bit of this chapter and talking about things like intentionality, likeness, and conformity, and as we talk about signification, what came to mind a little bit was, I know that in modern philosophy, people like Wittgenstein and people like that have spent a lot of time on linguistic issues and thinking about how do we determine what's significant, how do we think about things, how do words play into those kinds of things. And it strikes me that some of the discussions, and I haven't read a lot of Wittgenstein, we've more just talked a little bit about him in some of our previous discussions, but it seems to me that there is at least if not a direct solid line between some of these ideas of people like Aquinas and Occam and others. There's at least a relationship, and that Wittgenstein's ideas, even if they don't draw directly on some of these medievals, I think were there to be in some miraculous way an ability for some of these medieval thinkers to have a conversation with Wittgenstein, I think they would find that they have been having much of the same conversation, just with different background knowledge and different ideas. And it might actually be a quite fruitful discussion. Now, because I haven't read much of Wittgenstein, it's only as part of some of the overview of modern philosophers that we undertook and that I read, the book on the history of Christian philosophy that we did in the past. It's really only through that I've gotten some information about Wittgenstein. But I'd be interested in whether you see that same kind of pattern, or maybe not a direct line, some kind of at least parallel or some significance, to use a term, between what the medievals were thinking about.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Chuck. I think you're pulling on something that is extremely crucial, and that is this idea. I'm looking for my quote here. We're talking about the section in concepts and intellectual acts. Now, there's a citation at the beginning of this section of Peter Abelard. And Abelard says this, that an understanding is a certain action of the soul, but the form to which it is directed is a kind of imaginary and made-up thing which the mind contrives for itself. And the Latin word is fictum. Now, that's fiction. And so Peter Abelard here is talking about this concept that, let's just say, let's make it a concrete example. I'm looking at the tree in my front yard. So the medieval thinkers here are presuming there is something up in my mind, in my soul, some object that they're going to call a concept, some object that in my mind allows me to understand, reason about, investigate into, and interact with the thing in reality, the actual tree. So in other words, think of a picture of me thinking about a tree while looking at a tree. And the idea here from Abelard is that my mental image is a fiction. I don't actually have a tree in my mind. And if it's in my brain, for example, where such images are stored, obviously my brain is far too small to actually store a real tree. And that's what Abelard is saying. He's saying nothing more than that. These labels that we use are helpful for the mind. They help us think, but we should not confuse them with the real thing or for the real thing. And in fact, it's implicit in Abelard, if not explicit. It's implicit that the tree is the real thing, and it is the mental image of mine that is the fictitious copy. Now, this is at the heart of what the West calls essentialism, what perhaps goes all the way back to Plato and the cave. So in the cave, you have the fire, you have the light coming from the fire, projecting through objects and lighting the shadows up on the walls of the cave for the people in the cave to see. And there it is the shadows that are the images of the real items that the light is projecting through. And it's the same thing here with Abelard. Abelard is suggesting that it's the actual tree in reality that is the more real, the more material, the more true, the more genuine, authentic thing. And my mental representation is just a fiction that helps me deal with and cope with that, helps my mind represent it. I'm taking a lot of time to talk about this because we've had an inversion. And in fact, one might plausibly suggest that almost all of modernity relates to this inversion. And so the inversion is this idea of, like you say, for example, Wittgenstein. I also might think of folks like Nietzsche and other folks who are existentialists. And so you have essentialism on one side, and then you have existentialism on the other side. And the idea here is that in the existentialist way of thinking, it is the mental representation that is the real thing. And it is the ontologically real tree that is generated by or gains its existence by my perception of it. And so, in other words, to be is to be perceived, is, I believe, the way the classic phrase goes. And so here we are. We've got this push and pull, Chuck. We've got thinkers on two sides of the equation, and we have to ask, which is the primary? Now, is it more real for the mental representation to be the fiction that helps with the more real ontological reality of the tree? Or is the image in the mind the real thing, and reality is simply a projection of our mind? We have to ask ourselves this, and it's not at all clear that these two schools can coexist. It seems like reality is in some sense either one or the other in a primary sense. Now, nobody's denying that perception to some degree conditions our understanding of the ontological nature of reality. But the issue is, does it actually take precedence? And so what I think Wittgenstein and Nietzsche and other 19th and 20th century thinkers, other existentialists, in fact, were postulating was that inversion of which is primary. And putting you on the spot, Chuck, how do you feel about this representation of things? And is that really legitimate? Is it just as simple as, is the tree in reality the more real thing, or is the tree in my mind the more real thing that generates the tree?
Yeah, no, first of all, I would say that I think you're right, first of all, in pointing out that there is something to both sides of that. Even if we are essentialist, pun not intended, even then, there is something about the mental representation that's important and valuable and needs to be understood. It reminds me, actually, I don't remember where I came across, but it just popped in my mind as we were discussing this. I remember many years ago reading an account of people who, I don't know whether they were folks who were living in the Amazon or just didn't have any concept of a photograph, but people who did not have the concept of a photograph, being shown a photograph and not recognizing what's in it because their mind is not able to process the image because they haven't been trained to recognize that what they're seeing is an image of something in reality. And I remember finding that really interesting. I don't know that I necessarily connected it to this idea that we have today, but there is some sense where there is that connection. We're aware of situations in which our minds can play tricks on us, where we don't see things that are in plain sight because we don't recognize recognized. And so I wonder whether some of this idea, this existentialist idea of the reality being formed in our own mind, comes from these kinds of incidents. Now, obviously, it also ties very much into the idea that the individual human being, the I, is the key, the most important, and humanity is the center of everything. And so for human perception, obviously, then it becomes very important. But even then, even if we are primarily essentialists and we recognize that the true item is the thing that we're seeing and the mental representation we make of it is something else, there is some level of reality to even what we are perceiving. And then the question becomes, how do those things relate? It's interesting to me too that, of course, the medievals, it seemed rather obvious to them, as you pointed out, that the real item, the reality would be the tree in this example. And I'm looking at a tree outside my window too. And the medievals felt that the image in our mind almost seemed like obvious. It is only a fictum. And now that has changed. And yet I think there is a sense in which I think if we talk to every man and you ask him about what's the real thing, he would say, of course, the tree is the real thing. The image in your mind is just something you're seeing. And I wonder whether there is a sense in which that basic common sense idea that we need to pay a little bit more attention to it, even if it doesn't fully explain how is it then that we can miss things that are in plain sight. How is it that a person who's never seen a photograph cannot recognize what's in the photograph as an image? It's just really an interesting thought experiment. I think I probably lean towards the essentialist side, but there is some there with the idea that there's something real about the image. It's just what kind of real.